Welcome to the beautiful People's Security Bank Theater here at Lackawanna College. My name is Brian Costanzo from the college. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us on a great evening. Great to be back in person. I think this may be our first live audience event in quite a few months, so thank you for being part of it. Just a few items for you. As you can see, there's quite a few exit signs around here. Just take notice of the exit signs on your way out. Bathrooms are on the second level. There is access via elevator if you'd like to get up there and utilize the restrooms during the evening. I'd also just like to remind you to silence your cell phones during the event. This will be live streamed, so we want to make sure we limit disruptions as best we can. It'll be on a Zoom platform, so we thank you for doing that in advance. Again, welcome. Hope you enjoy the evening, and I'd like to introduce the MC for this evening, Mr. John Cowder.
Thank you, Brian. After Glenna speaks tonight, if you have any questions, there's a microphone down here. If you would come up and sort of line up to the right of the microphone, we'll take your questions then at the end of the lecture. And good evening. It's good to see all of you here. If you're like myself, this is probably one of the first times you've been out in almost a year. Is that true? So I want to sincerely thank you all for coming here tonight. I'm John Cowder. I'm an architect, an AIA architect, and a longtime friend of Glenna Lang and her husband, Alexander von Hoffman. I'm certain this will be a fun and an entertaining evening. Over the last 10 years, I encouraged and sometimes helped Glenna develop her book. I personally know how much of her life has been dedicated to this important document. Many people were interviewed in the process, revealing not just Jane's life, but an incredibly detailed history of the Scranton area. If you live anywhere near here, you will be as mesmerized by this book as I was. This book was a catalyst for this week's Jane Jacobs events. A few months ago, Glenna told me that she had finally completed her new book and was looking for the best place to launch it. You know, Scranton seems to have this innate ability to form the most incredible relationships to make things happen. I told her I thought she had asked the right person. I happen to be on the board of trustees of the Scranton Public Library, and I knew right away the best place of all, as universities and schools across the country continue to close their libraries due to financial issues and now the pandemic, they look more and more to their public library systems. As it turns out, the Albright shares their library with Lackawanna College in exchange for help with security issues and, believe it or not, the use of the college's auditorium 4 times a year. Some of you may not know it, but Jane Jacobs spent 4 years here at the Scranton Central High School, now known as Lackawanna College. I mean, how perfect is that? A book launch about Jane Jacobs' first city at Jane's former high school. But was it possible in the middle of a pandemic? Well, with a little help from Scott Thomas, the CEO of the Albright Library, and Brian Costanzo of Luzerne College, we were able to acquire this beautiful, historic auditorium for Glenna's launch. Some of you are probably sitting in the exact spot that Jane sat in when she was a student here. And she also was up here on this stage. She loved to perform, from what I understand, Glenna, and she was probably up here quite frequently. If that's not walking in Jane's footsteps, I don't know what is. We have with us tonight Maria McDonald. She's the Executive Director of the Center for the Living City. Maria has been instrumental in making this and the week's events possible. She will recognize this evening's sponsors and tell you a little bit about the week's events. Maria?
Thank you, John. Speaking of walking in Jane's footsteps, I have the honor to be the executive director of the Center for the Living City. The Center for the Living City was founded in 2005 and holds the singular distinction of being the only urbanist foundation founded with Jane Jacobs. I'm also a professor of architecture at Marywood University's School of Architecture, which happens to be located a few blocks from Jane's childhood home, which is also a few blocks from my childhood home. So this is deeply personal to us and to Marywood University's School of Architecture, in that we were founding our School of Architecture rooted in the values of community, inclusion, giving back to our neighbors. At the same time, the Center for the Living City was being founded. So at this intersection, we find ourselves today celebrating Jane's birthday and kicking off a 5-day festival celebrating all of her life. This is a journey that Glenna helped launch several years ago, and we're so grateful to her for coming to our architecture school and talking with us in the past, and to see the book come to fruition tonight is just nothing short of a dream come true. So we wanted to thank all of our sponsors for supporting us. The Hawk Family Foundation, right from the start, has been one of our largest believers in this endeavor. Lackawanna College, thank you. Marywood University, of course, and the Center for the Living City. So tonight what we will be doing is, this is our 4th installment of our Jane Jacobs lecture series that we put on through the Center for the Living City. There will be more lectures that go on throughout the year. This is our home base lecture featuring Glenna. And so there are people following along right now virtually, a couple of hundred actually following along on Zoom. And we're here for those of you on Zoom. We're also, we have a wonderful audience here in person in Scranton at Jane's former high school. So welcome to the Jane Jacobs Lecture, and follow our events at observescranton.org. Every day this week, there will be walks and talks, and there'll be virtual and in person. And our first Friday launch will feature 15 different exhibits from both the Lackawanna College, University of Scranton, and the Marywood University School of Architecture students. They'll be on display if you check out observescranton.org. We're up to about 16 different exhibits, all based on different elements of the work of Jane and her complete body of work. And then we conclude on Saturday evening. Please join us at the Radisson for Story Slam, which is a fun, wonderful evening out put on by the Fringe Festival, which celebrates everything about growing up here in Northeastern Pennsylvania. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for being on Zoom. And I'm so looking forward to this talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. I'd just like to say that there are 2 other sponsors here, very important ones. The AIA of Northeastern Pennsylvania is sponsoring this event tonight, and there are AIA learning credits available. If you did not register for this event, there is a sign-in sheet at the desk at the entrance to the auditorium. So if you haven't signed in or registered and you still want that AIA credit, you can do it there. The other sponsor is the Scranton Public Library, and I'm very close to the Albright myself. It's right across the street here. Jane spent a lot of time at the library. She was an avid reader. Today is such a special day. If Jane Jacobs were alive today, she would be celebrating her 105th birthday. So I guess we need to celebrate that for her. This morning, our very own Mayor Paige Cognetti dedicated this as Jane Jacobs Day. We are so honored to have our own first woman mayor of Scranton here with us tonight. I must say, it takes some courage to accept the responsibility that comes with being the mayor of Scranton. I'm certain Jane Jacobs, a pioneering woman herself, would be very impressed with your leadership so far. That appears to align with Jane's by putting people ahead of politics. Please, let us give Mayor Paige Gebhardt Cognetti our warmest welcome. Mayor?
All right, John, that made me tear up a little bit. It really is an incredible honor to stand up here and see so many friends. Hi, Sandra and Maury, that I haven't seen in so long. Oh, it really is an honor to be here. And Maria, Glenna, we wouldn't be here without you. I do have the proclamation with me. It was so fun this morning. What a great time to dedicate Jane Jacobs Day, May 4th, from here on out in the city of Scranton. And I tried to write down all of the sponsors from the website, but it was taking way too much time, and I realized that they would be up here. So, quickly, obviously, Marywood University and the Center for the Living City. Don Rinaldi, when you called me about this last year, I couldn't believe that this was going to happen. Glenna, when we connected, it was just incredible that this was really going to happen. I lived in the West Village in 2014, 15, 16 before I moved permanently to Scranton, and Jane Jacobs Way is on Hudson Street. It was one block from where I lived. So the idea of the sidewalk ballet was something that I got to experience and watch from my own balcony in the West Village for a couple of years. And I love Jane Jacobs. I had a friend who, when I was at business school, who was also at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, which, Alex, I know you're a professor at. And my friend Jared and I actually lived together. We roomed together when we interned in 2013. Or it must have been 2014 when we first got to New York. And he was both at GSD and HBS. And so we always talked about Jane Jacobs and the sidewalk ballet and this idea of how these things work. But I didn't realize she was from Scranton until I moved here in 2016. So to be able to stand here with you all, Glenna, to have the honor of you handing me your book today, this morning, on the steps of City Hall, it is an honor, but it is also, it's a great responsibility. We have a huge responsibility at the city to be able to keep the principles of Jane Jacobs alive in our own city. I think we know that public service is something that you go into because you care about people, you care about your community. You don't usually get that if you haven't seen that firsthand. We have a lot of very prominent public servants in the world right now that are from Scranton. One in particular is sitting in the Oval Office. And I am confident that Jane Jacobs, having grown up right here, literally where we're standing, got that idea, got the values of public service from being a part of this community, from seeing in Scranton how people take care of each other, from seeing in Scranton how neighbors watch after each other, how you look after your neighbor's children, how in our own condo complex just last week we had a neighbor who fell, and we're in constant communication with her family to see when she's going to come back, how we can help her reacclimate to her condo. That's the spirit of Scranton. It's the spirit that I was attracted to when I first came here 15 years ago, that people had grandparents that still lived on the same streets as them, or they grew up in the house that they're still living in, they still own, that family still owns. Those family roots that run so deep is not something that you see everywhere. You don't see it in every single place. I love where I grow up, love it, it's wonderful, but it's much more transient than, as families and generations go, than a place like Scranton. We truly have a community here that looks out for one another. Jane Jacobs embodied that, she protected that, she made sure that those neighborhoods in New York didn't get cut up like that. And here at the city, we're putting together an absolutely incredible team that's going to look forward for city planning, look forward to see what it is that we can do in the city, what we can be doing better. Last week, I got to stand with United Neighborhood Centers and launch the Pine Brook Revitalization Plan. That neighborhood has so many incredible business anchors. It's got a lot of residents, but a lot of residential streets that haven't been taken care of. I see Mary Pat Ward in the audience. She knows that. She knows we've got a lot of work to do, but we're working with our partners to do it. We're in tandem with NeighborWorks in Westside. They're doing some incredible things in Westside, especially along Main Avenue. We're partnering with them. We're working in Southside. Now, the Cedar Avenue project, the Iron District project's been going on for quite some time, but we're just now starting to see some of the results of all of that. We got to cut the ribbon on the Scranton Counseling Center in Southside last month. It's going to completely change that neighborhood. It's going to become an anchor for a lot more businesses and a lot more services in Southside, right where our residents live, some of our residents who need some of those services the very most. Amanda Halleck is in the audience, and she is the transformative person in our city government that's working to revolutionize how we do business in Scranton internally and externally. And I mention Amanda also because Glenna and Alex, their daughter and Amanda are friends, and when I first hired Amanda, I got a picture from a friend of a friend. Hey, this was wonderful woman that you've hired that's friend with our friend's daughter. I mean, the roads always lead to Scranton. We know this, it's true. And to, again, be here to celebrate Jane Jacobs just shows that. So there's always a tie, there's always roots. We're gonna keep working hard to bring a train to Scranton. I know that Jane Jacobs was I know that Jane wasn't, a proponent necessarily. I mean, of course she was a proponent. She didn't focus on mass transit in that way, but I think the principles of how she lived and wanted to see cities grow, that a train back and forth, again, this isn't brand new, right? Again, having that train back and forth between Scranton and New York would be exactly the kind of thing that she would want us to advocate for. So I was on the phone with Secretary Buttigieg's staffer today talking about that. We'll be on the phone soon to talk about it and discuss. We're gonna keep pushing for that and keep pushing in Scranton with our team, with all of our partners, with all of the incredible people that we have in the city, in this area, that are rooting not just for Scranton, our whole area, and are just rooting for people to have a better quality of life and to be not only proud of where they grew up, but want to live where they grew up. So thank you again. Glenna, congratulations. Maria, thank you for putting this together. Alex, thank you for being here. And again, it's a true honor.
Thank you so much, Mayor. That's inspirational. Jane Jacobs' seminal book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, was required reading when I was a young architecture student. She was a prominent and outspoken critic of urban renewal, and it hit close to home in 1968 when I was a part of a successful effort to keep the bicentennial from displacing the 22,000-strong Black community of Mantua, West Philadelphia. While I never met Jane, she had tremendous influence on me and was impacted communities worldwide, whether they realized it or not. The death and life of great American cities literally changed the world. Nearly 10 years ago, I read an article in the Scranton Times-Tribune featuring Glenna Lang and Marjorie Wunsch, who had co-authored a book called Genius of Common Sense. Two things caught my eye. Since I'm a long-term Dunmorian myself, the article's titled Dunmore Native Changed View on U.S. Cities, and also Jane Jacobs, the focus of the piece. Thanks to the Times article, I discovered that Jane had grown up only a few blocks from my own house. I realized that my children and I had been walking the very same streets that shaped Jane's life. In response to that discovery, in the spring of 2011, our local AIA chapter sponsored a formal dedication of 1712 Monroe Avenue in Dunmore, the childhood home of Jane Jacobs. We were pleased at that time to have Glenna Lang in this ceremony. And since then, Glenna, her husband, Alex von Hoffman, and I have become very close friends. I am very pleased to be part of Glenna's new book launch, Jane Jacobs' First City. Please, let's have a warm welcome for my very good friend, Glenna Lang.
Hello, everybody. I'm just knocked out by all of you coming here, about the generous words of the previous speakers. Words just will not do for what I'm feeling at the moment. So thank you, and thank you to all those out there in Zoom land and live stream, and you're here in spirit, and I can feel it, so thank you so much. I'd like to introduce you to the well-known Jane Jacobs and give you a romp through Scranton's history and Jane's formative years. I will then highlight some of my discoveries about Jane's early years in the research for this book. They may surprise even those of you who thought they knew the remarkable Jane. In 1961, Jane Jacobs published a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities that would change the world and how we think about cities. Her book continues to reverberate today, even 60 years later. In the vivid and the pointed prose of the very first sentence, Jane boldly declared the book's intent. This book is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding. In the well-argued and tightly organized 23 chapters, she guided readers through her observations, analysis, and startling conclusions. Old buildings and neighborhoods have value and should not be destroyed and replaced with lifeless, modern, high-rise structures. Communities were essential units in cities. New developments and uniform suburbs were less desirable than the cheerful hurly-burly of great cities. Downtowns were for people, not for cars. After working for years as an editor for Architectural Forum magazine, in 1958, thanks to a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, Jane could devote full time to writing her book on what she had observed about cities and how they work. She typed the pages of her groundbreaking volume while in her Greenwich Village home, a former mom and pop store on the industrial edge of this now affluent, but then offbeat, New York City neighborhood. She and her architect husband, Bob Jacobs, had rehabilitated the 3-story brick building themselves. Jane described what she saw from her window overlooking the main street on which she lived. She studied the activity below on the sidewalks and coined the term sidewalk ballet to conjure up the procession of people walking by on their way to school, to work, or to run errands. The ballet varied throughout the day with a procession of characters going about their business. In Death and Life, Jane identified her conditions that made for vibrant and thriving cities. She explained the need for mixed uses of buildings and their functions and advocated for short blocks and the choices they offered. She recognized the advantage of density in fostering community, and she extolled the need for a diversity of ages of buildings. These are all conditions that encourage overall robust city diversity. They are concepts commonly used today when we discuss cities. Before Jane's book came out, these ideas clashed with the prevailing conventional wisdom of the time. Jane's critics, and she raised the hackles of many of them, faulted her for basing her conclusions too heavily on what she saw in New York's Greenwich Village. This book, my book, refutes their criticism of her. While Jane was writing her book, she was drawn into participating in efforts to stop the demolition of sections of her own tight-knit neighborhood, an approach known as urban renewal. The city wanted to study the West Village as a potential slum clearance project. More often than not, that resulted in the destruction of people's homes and small businesses to make way for modern towers in the park or highways that sliced up the city. This is a perfect example of superblocks of public housing in New York in the mid-1950s. They replaced vibrant, low-rise communities, a very sad thing. Jane's book and her activism on the issues she wrote about inspired me to create a book about her for young adults. As a nonconformist and free thinker who cared deeply about her community and was not afraid to speak truth to power, she was a terrific role model for young people. During my research for Genius of Common Sense, I learned that Jane had been born and raised for her first 18 years in Scranton. At the time, few people knew this fact, and it is still a revelation to many. Until recently, I think many Scrantonians were unaware of who Jane was or her importance. In January 2008, I took my first trip to see where one of the most influential urbanists had spent her most formative years. Even that short stay in Scranton to see Jane's home, her high school, and remnants of the old central city brought alive for me a bygone era and Jane's early life. 3 years later, when John Cowder asked me to speak at the dedication of Jane's childhood home, I jumped at the chance to return to Scranton. This was an opportunity to dig deeper into Jane's roots and how the city might have affected her, something no one before had ever undertaken. I wanted to understand Scranton and what it was like to live there when the city was the booming anthracite coal capital of the world and the major manufacturing center before hard times hit and the Great Depression took its toll. I initially thought this project might make an interesting article, but it yielded so many discoveries, so many untapped sources and places to look at and people to interview that it turned into a book. Both Jane and the city of Scranton itself became the main characters. The future city of Scranton was born on September 11th, 1840, when several men from the East brought new ideas and cutting-edge technology to the area. They planned to construct an iron forge and manufacture pig iron and nails using local ore, limestone, and coal. On the site known as Slocum Hollow, where only 5 houses, a grist mill, and a few other small structures stood, arose a settlement that by 1856 was large enough to incorporate as the borough of Scranton, and 10 years later as the city of Scranton. Here is downtown Scranton in 1906. It's a mere 40 years after it legally became a full-fledged city. It had risen meteorically, as one of the early historians called its precipitous transformation. This was the lively, splendid, promising city Jane's parents chose to settle in and start a business and a family. On May 4th, 1916, Jane Isabel Butzner was born on Electric Street in the newly emerging Green Ridge neighborhood. It was a streetcar suburb of the city. Its growth was stimulated by transportation extending into previously sparsely populated land, but still within the city limits. Having recently lost their young son, who was only 2 years old, had lost their son due to a childhood disease, Dr. John Decker Butzner and former school teacher and nurse Bess Robison Butzner and their 6-year-old daughter, Betty, were especially thrilled at the arrival of a new baby. Jane's father delivered the infant girl at home, and the parents chose the old family name of Jane. Within the next few years, the family would welcome 2 more little boys, John and Jimmy. The Butzners bought this newly built house where Jane was born at 815 Electric Street from a man down the block who worked as a mason and carpenter. He had built this single dwelling as a business venture, a common way for individuals with construction skills to earn a living. The aggregation of multiple small projects like this one made for variation among the design, size, and ornamentation of houses along the street, and led to a mixture of people in different lines of work and a range of incomes in the community. The Butzner's next-door neighbor on one side worked as a plaster contractor. On the other side lived a manager of a company that supplied pipes to coal breakers. Across the street were more bigger and fancier houses with more affluent families. Even in her first few years, Jane was not only observing the sidewalk in front of her family home, but she was also experiencing it. As in much of the rest of Scranton, the sidewalk consisted of a line of adjacent slate squares. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. Slate was plentiful alongside the area's abundant coal deposits. This photo captures Jane and her brother John while their Aunt Emily was visiting and shows some toy vehicles that they could ride. Jane reminisced about the vehicles that her mother called velocipedes. They were really tricycles, Jane told the interviewer, and we also had a little stuffed bear that stood about 1.5 feet high. I got very irritated at this bear. It had 4 wheels and they were very tiny. Every time you hit a joint in the slate sidewalk, you had to pick it up and move it to the next slate. I would get exasperated at that. It was better than nothing on the sidewalk riding up and down, but I learned to get out in sufficient time to stake my claim on one of these velocipedes, not on the bear. Jane's personality was already surfacing. The Butzner's house, indicated by the star, was situated on the longest block in the neighborhood. It allowed the children to ride a good distance on their wheeled vehicles without crossing a street, but it made for a long walk to visit residents on the blocks developed to the north. With her close observations, Jane took this all in. Good sense must have prevailed because the city decided to cut a street through this wide rectangular block. In her Death and Life book, Jane would include a diagram showing the advantages of short blocks compared to long and how they created a variety of routes and therefore experiences as well. Heading downhill at the west end of the long block, the Butzners encountered the cluster of stores known as Greenridge Corners. Nearby were industrial buildings such as a plaster factory, and in the walkable distance, giant coal breakers loomed. George Sanderson, who blazed the trail into Greenridge and subdivided the land into plots, did not mind erecting his own house amidst industry. He built a substantial and attractive home not far from factories and businesses. Schools and churches were also sprinkled in. What Jane would later call mixed uses, the juxtaposition of residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial edifices occurred organically in Scranton. When Jane was not quite 5 years old, the Butzners had outgrown their compact house. Decker, as her father was called, and Bess Butzner and their 4 young children moved to a larger house less than a mile away in the neighboring borough of Dunmore. The Butzners bought the house on Monroe Avenue between Electric and Delaware Streets from George and Martha Yinke in February 1921. Mr. Yinke had emigrated from Germany. He worked as a self-employed contractor and most likely designed and built this fine house. With its greater size and brick exterior, it stood out from the others on the block. Neighbors here had also emigrated from various countries, including Sweden, Austria, Belgium, and Ireland. As you neared the Electric Street end, houses were smaller and more affordable to lower-income folks. People of Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish faiths resided in close proximity on this very block and throughout the Scranton area. This section of Dunmore, where the Butzners lived, had a multitude of small businesses scattered within it. On the next block over to the west, Thomas McClintock had a grain house and a florist shop on the corner, which he had opened at this location decades before. Across the street from McClintock's florist was a grocery store owned and run by Doug Oakey. William Rinaldi had a barber shop in this building and must have rented the space from the Okies. These are but a few examples of the many. Building a small addition with a large window, people could convert part of their home into a store. These micro-businesses were found most frequently at corners and along the busier streets like Electric or Delaware, but some, like the potato chip and peanut butter factory, which Jane described in her book, Economy of Cities, were in backyards and alleys. In trucks or horse-drawn wagons, people selling their wares from beyond the immediate neighborhood or outside the boundaries of Dunmore and Scranton rumbled down Monroe Avenue and nearby streets, bringing their business to the local residents. Known as hucksters, they were often immigrants or children of immigrants. They sold fresh fruits, vegetables, and poultry from their farms and made their rounds regularly to customers who emerged from their houses when they heard them coming. The city people counted on them for their products. Here is a Polish family, the Walczaks, on their family farm in Abington. Their sons headed into the city each week to sell the farm's produce. Thus, the lives of people from all walks of life intersected naturally. In Scranton and Dunmore, when Jane was a schoolgirl and attended Dunmore's Washington School No. 3, everyone walked to school because they all lived nearby, students, teachers, and the principal alike. All Scranton and Dunmore schools were truly neighborhood schools. Almost all grammar school students resided within a 15 to 20-minute walk. When the school board hired teachers, they usually assigned them to the school nearest where they lived. One of Jane's teachers literally lived next door to the Washington School. Its principal lived 2 doors down from the Butzner's. Children and adult educators sometimes ran into one another along the way and walked together. Furthermore, everyone walked to the school twice a day because they all went home for lunch during the hour-and-a-half break. The last principal of this school, before it was closed and eventually demolished in the mid-1970s, judged it the most beautiful building in Dunmore, inside and out. In grammar school, Jane's character evidenced itself, and she caught the eye of her fellow students and her teachers. She was bright, independent, and outspoken, but not necessarily well-behaved. She recalled to family and friends that her first and second grade teachers were her favorites, but her enjoyment of grammar school plummeted from then on. In third grade, she convinced her classmates not to raise their hands, to promise they would brush their teeth every day for the rest of their lives. Her father had explained to her the seriousness of a promise. Surely no one could keep such a promise, she told her teacher and the class. Jane never suffered fools. When her fourth grade teacher declared that all cities develop around waterfalls, Jane stated that this did not make sense. She had seen a little waterfall in a park on the city's edge, but it had nothing to do with how Scranton came to be. Her sixth grade teacher signed Jane's autograph book, referring to her euphemistically as the most original one in the class. For eighth grade, Jane's parents paid a small tuition to enroll her in Scranton's George Washington School No. 1. Thus positioning her to go to Scranton Central High School the following year. Located in the beautiful Gothic Revival building that housed the city's school administration, it allowed Jane, to her delight, to take the streetcar to school each day and explore the central city during lunchtime with other tuition students who resided too far from school to walk home from lunch. The schoolmates saw architectural treasures as the old post office, before it was demolished for a newer version, sadly, the Lackawanna County Courthouse, and the Scranton Dry Goods Department Store, where Jane amused them by going up the down escalator, the only moving stairway in the city. Not only schools, but the city's organizational life connected people. Citizens, young and old, came together from beyond their immediate neighborhoods to form groups for a common purpose, a shared interest, or to reinforce similar beliefs. The clubs a person belonged to defined her or his life so well that obituaries routinely enumerated them. As in other cities when Jane was growing up, Scranton's staggering number of clubs, societies, associations, and organizations comprised a significant part of daily life. They not only fostered a sense of community and citizenship, but also expanded the universe of individuals in the city. Becoming a member of the well-known organization called Girl Scouts was enormously important in Jane's personal development. She was never enamored of school, but she thoroughly enjoyed being a scout. Girl Scouts offered a welcome respite from the constraints of school and helped nurture her interests and reinforced her sense of a woman's boundless possibilities. From the time she was 10 and continuing beyond high school, she attended weekly meetings after school, spent summers at the Girl Scouts Camp Archibald, and eventually was among a select few who attained the highest rank of eaglet, as did her sister Betty. The Girl Scouts' practice of democratic self-governance, their incorporation of good literature through their magazine and books to read for badges, their belief in inclusion of girls of all backgrounds, and their emphasis on female empowerment were just some of the things that appealed to Jane. In scouting, Jane found the freedom to indulge her curiosity, imagination, and creativity, as well as an opportunity to observe nature, people, and urban life. In Jane's day, the Girl Scout Handbook actually contained a chapter on observation, both of nature and in cities. Jane remained an avid Girl Scout even after she entered Scranton's citywide Central High School, known as one of the finest schools in the country, where we are this very minute. It was located within a block of her 8th grade school and across the street from one of her favorite destinations, the Albright Library. Although her high school grades would never land her on the honor roll, Jane's friends remembered her as really smart. She preferred reading and thinking on her own to studying for tests. If she liked a particular subject, she worked hard. She joined the drama club and acted in quite a few plays, but Jane's overriding passion was writing. By her junior year, an article in Impressions, the high school magazine, listed Jane among the 7 especially active members of the writing club. During her senior year, she became poetry editor of Impressions. At Central, Jane's classes, extracurricular activities, and homeroom were comprised of students of diverse backgrounds who lived in Scranton proper, plus some from its vicinity. Carl Marzani arrived in Scranton from Italy at age 12 with his family and did not know a word of English. A motivated and quick learner, Carl was promoted at record speed through the grades and entered Central High a couple of years before Jane. In his 4-volume memoir, he wrote about his early days in Scranton and paid tribute to several teachers at the high school who had gone out of their way to tutor him in English, and in the end guided him in getting a scholarship to a top-notch college. He felt his was not an isolated experience. Sharing an interest in drama and writing, Jane and he became lifelong friends. He too was a keen observer, an independent thinker, and excellent writer. From early childhood on, Jane had a passion for urban life. Her attraction to the central city section of her hometown was so overpowering that it transformed the trip to the dentist into an adventure. Actually, I was, from the time I was a very small child, interested in my own city. These are Jane's words. And I was interested especially in the downtown. I was so interested in it that I liked it when I had a dental appointment. And believe me, it was not painless dentistry in those days. But I liked it because I could go downtown. I thought it was fascinating. Scranton was the metropolis of the entire anthracite coal mining region. Freight and passenger railroads connected Scranton to New York, Washington, D.C., and the rest of the country. During Jane's years in Scranton, much beautiful old architecture still existed. At the turn of the last century, this block of Wyoming Street between Lackawanna and Spruce shows the magnificent domed coal exchange building, an office building built in 1885 and demolished in the early 1960s. The electric streetcars seen in the distance on the far left had been running since 1886, part of the first successful streetcar system in the country, giving Scranton its nickname, the Electric City. Dr. Butzner set up his practice at the far end of the block. In 1930, the bustling, packed, and thriving city of Scranton was the third largest city in Pennsylvania with a population of 143,000 compared to just 76,000 today. It was surpassed only by Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. While manufacturing iron and steel had previously been important industries, mining the enormously rich deposits of anthracite coal and preparing them for market had taken over. Scranton, where I grew up, Jane would later write, experienced its first and only explosive growth from about 1905 to 1920. Its experts were growing, especially coal, textiles, and a correspondence school that educated people by mail. The textile plants, for the most part, were transplanted industries located in Scranton because the wives and daughters of the coal miners provided a pool of very cheap labor. In 1914, the newspaperman and cartoonist Bill Steinke sketched this charming illustration showing the diversity and profusion of industry in Scranton. Such a variety and range of industry, Jane concluded in her book, Economy of Cities, was of utmost importance to the economic well-being of a city. When Scranton became too dependent on coal and the demand for it declined, its economy sputtered and tanked. Beginning with a devastating coal strike that lasted through the winter of 1925 to 1926, Jane watched the once booming metropolis slide into the Great Depression. She graduated from high school in 1933. As her grammar school classmate, Marie Van Bergen, said to me, "Can you think of a worse time to graduate? You were graduating into nothing." After high school, the intelligent and talented Marie went to work at a Central City shoe store, while Jane bartered her writing and observation talents for an unpaid internship at the morning newspaper. At the paper, as you can see in this all-male newsroom, she was one of the few females, but she earned the respect of the more experienced reporters. She not only got to review plays and books, but she wrote news articles and gained insights into the politics, institutions, and workings of the city, including its seamier side. The notorious red light district and the mafia especially intrigued her. As I unearthed and assembled shards of heretofore unknown information about Jane's childhood and the Scranton she knew, I made quite a few surprising discoveries about her early life. It took talking with Jane's childhood friend Marie Jane's letters to her family, plus the newspapers of the times, to reveal the extent of Jane's involvement with and her dedication to the Girl Scouts. In many ways, Scouts encouraged Jane's passion for writing through poetry contests and excellent editors of their magazine, and they nurtured her skills of observation, self-direction, and leadership. From age 10 to 18, Scouts were a constant and special part of her life. Another fortunate discovery for me was the importance of the African American community in Scranton. Jane's relationship to this community, concentrated between Central High and Tech High School, became abundantly clear. Shown here are neighborhood kids at the Progressive Community Center and below at John Strader's birthday party, and his sister is here today. Through her schools, Girl Scouts, and chance encounters in everyday life, Jane intermingled with African Americans. This held true for her siblings and other Scrantonians as well. There were African American doctors, dentists, and business people who worked with and employed whites. After high school, Jane's friend Betty Totley, an African American, and her brother John took part in a youth forum that discussed challenges facing African American youth looking for jobs in the city. Undoubtedly, Jane attended the forum. John would become a prominent civil rights judge appointed by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. In Death and Life, Jane declared, and I quote, "Our country's most serious social problem, its racial segregation and discrimination." We now understand that her concern about this issue began in Scranton. Through census records, city directories, and newspapers, I unlocked the identities of and information about Jane's classmates, who ranged from children of coal miners and recent immigrants to white-collar professionals. Scranton's populations proved extraordinarily diverse, economically, socially, ethnically, and racially. Yet the culture that traveled to and existed in Scranton, such as great theater, including Broadway-bound shows, and the wonderful Everhart Museum, was astounding. Jane, the aspiring poet, attended a presentation by Robert Frost, then America's foremost, most famous poet, at the Women's Century Club to which her mother belonged. Other prominent poets read and lectured at her high school. The importance of Jane's internship at the daily newspaper, the Scranton Republican, has been underestimated. Despite her flippant remark that she mainly penned articles about the meetings of the Women of the Moose and the Ladies' Nest of Owls clubs, Jane cut her journalistic teeth here and proved her talents to the editors, who praised her on the op-ed page when she departed for New York. Jane valued the press's feeling of responsibility to report impartially all that was going on, from municipal elections to achievements of school children. Newspapers served as the city's primary means of communication. The city's papers continually kept track of, recognized, and commended its citizens of all backgrounds, reporting on everything from piano recitals to who made a school's honor roll. My discovery of school records, which luckily included Jane's and her high school classmates' progress, confirmed Jane's fascination with history. In her history classes, she consistently earned some of her few high grades. An artifact owned by her family, a rare 1885 history of Scranton, which Jane could not have resisted reading, also helped convince me that Jane knew and loved her city's history. As a writer, she used ample historical evidence in her books to make her points. Later in life, Jane wrote that when she traveled to Alaska for research on her book about her aunt, who taught indigenous peoples there in the early 1900s, she said, "I found myself wishing I had a whole extra life to live to be a historian." In her last book, Dark Age Ahead, published in 2004, Jane warned about the dangers of mass amnesia and the loss of the past. These and many more revelations persuaded me that Scranton had a huge impact on Jane and her ideas. Even though Jane never specifically named her first city in her initial world-changing book, she hinted at Scranton's influence. These observations that I made in New York were not the first seeds of the death and life of great American cities, she said. In her last years, her conversation and thoughts increasingly turned to Scranton. In Scranton, Jane had witnessed and experienced the many types of diversity and the messy complexity of her city. She learned the value of the walkable neighborhoods within the city. In an era now vanishing from memory, in this medium-sized city, citizens regularly participated in neighborhood as well as citywide activities such as an annual cleanup week and the community chest campaign that brought the entire citizenry together. Emphasizing the theme of inclusivity, a pamphlet produced by the chest comprised of 34 of the city's organizations declared, "There is not a single individual in our midst today who does not come within the scope of the community chest's influence. Everyone in Scranton and Dunmore either helps or is helped by it. This is a work that knows neither race nor creed." And this is in 1922. By uniting the whole city, young and old, rich and poor, they fostered a strong sense of community, social responsibility, and civic pride. During polio and influenza outbreaks, Scranton's Director of Public Safety put out a front-page call in the morning newspaper requesting all physicians in the city to confer with the Department of Safety on the best way of preventing an epidemic. A serious and productive meeting ensued with Dr. Butzner among the leaders. The Scranton of Jane's childhood was replete with differing political views and a broad array of ethnicities, religions, income levels, and occupations. Yet its residents exhibited a sense of cohesion that transcended their differences. Jane embraced this sense of community as it had embraced her. Many of our parents and grandparents grew up in such medium-sized, manageable, tolerant, industrial cities that cared deeply about educating their young people and offered opportunities for all. It was this kind of city that shaped Jane Jacobs and her understanding of the qualities in cities that allow for civic connections despite our differences. If we observe Jane and what her city conveyed to her, we may find the key to uniting ourselves. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions? Would you like to come up here and ask Glenna a few questions about Scranton or Jane? I have a question.
Okay.
I know you've spoken to schools here. 10 years ago you did.
That's right, the middle school in Dunmore.
And I mean, very few children understand what happened here, you know, the history of Scranton and Dunmore alike. I'm wondering what your opinion is of how the schools should look at this.
I think it's a great place to start learning about history. Your own backyard, what could be better? Children can research the very house or building that they live in. There's lots of information to be found out. From there, they can expand and learn about the old history of Scranton. They can go around the city and talk to people in other neighborhoods, talk to old-timers. I'd say that one of the most valuable resources here in Scranton are the elderly people. And I was lucky enough, because of John having the dedication, Jane's friend Marie Van Bergen-Mansway called John. She was 95 years old, and she managed to find your phone number, left a message, and said, I have a lot to tell. I was Jane Jacobs' really good friend all through grammar school, and I kept in touch with her family after she went away to New York. And she was an invaluable source. So there's so many ways that children could learn history and feel really connected to it. And
right, I think
yeah.
Your book is not just about Jane, which kind of surprised me. I thought this would be a book about Jane, but it's really about the history of this area. And it's so detailed. I mean, I live in Dunmore, and I could walk through your book, literally, and experience Dunmore over again. Things that I never knew about. Some of these buildings that you show are still here.
Some are.
And I know when I first came here back in 1973, George Washington School number 3 was still there. I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
It was pretty dilapidated.
Maria went to school there.
Did you?
Yeah.
I would encourage all of you to read her book. It really means a lot to anyone who lives here, because you'll learn a lot about how Scranton developed and your own neighborhoods. Someone have a question? Yes, would you like to come up here?
And I'll just add to what you said, John. I think that it is about Scranton. I think of it as a dual portrait of both Jane and the city, but Scranton is not completely different than other cities. So it's of interest to people who grew up in such places as Newark or, Nashville. I don't know, lots of them.
I'm not from the area. We have a summer home up here, and I've just soon begin to figure out how lovely a town this is. But I was wondering if you could give us some idea of your thoughts on what Jane espoused that could apply to the challenges of cities like Scranton and Newark, you just mentioned. Today in terms of preserving, and is there an appetite to embrace these concepts?
I think there is an appetite. One of Jane's main principles, if we could call them principles, she was not in favor of big top-down plans. She liked smaller units. She loved community input, civic engagement, and the festival is called Observe Scranton because the thing that is most important is that people look with their own eyes, that they watch their city, and when they observe things, they might decide that there would be a good way to fix something, or something that was never done before might occur to people getting together, community groups who might not have known one another before. Those are some of her I'd say, biggest takeaways.
So the roadmap is there.
It is, and another really important thing is she did not have formulas. It was not a one-size-fits-all approach to cities. It was that you examine each case on an individual basis and study it, and that the people who live in a place know the most about it, and they should be consulted on issues of, tearing down or building or you name it.
Common sense.
Common sense, there we go. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. When I observed Scranton in its history, and I noticed even in the book that many people lived outside of, let's say, downtown Scranton. They came from Greenwich, as we saw, and from Dunmore, from other parts, and they did their commerce in Scranton. And we saw buildings like the Coal Exchange and many, many architecturally significant buildings here in Scranton. But now it seems an observation that I have now, currently, is that people want to live in those buildings. It's not commerce in those buildings as much as it is people who would like to live there. And there are a lot of young people. And I think, maybe this isn't a question, but it's an observation, that people are looking to live in the inner cities and just raise their families and everything, and I think that's a good thing.
I completely agree with you, and I guess for the first time there are more people living in cities than anywhere else. The balance has tipped, and also they are practicing the idea of, like, say, the Connell building downtown, of repurposing buildings so that old buildings can have new uses. I think young people are finding that it's wonderful to be able to walk everywhere. If you live in Central City, it can't be that far away to get to almost anything you need. So I think it's a wonderful trend, and I hope it continues.
I think it adds to the vibrancy because people would do their commerce and then maybe go home, and you'd see Tuesday night and Thursday night or something, businesses would be open in Scranton. But now you see people walking around, which I think is a very, very good thing.
It's a great thing.
And they're occupying those buildings that once were the pillars of commerce here, which is good. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a great observation.
I think we're running a little bit out of time here. There are 3 Jane's Walks that I would encourage you to participate in. Tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, Norma Reese, she's here somewhere. There she is. Norma Reese, a good friend of ours, is conducting a tour of the Forest Hill Cemetery, which will be very interesting. That's a beautiful cemetery. I walk my dog there occasionally. And tomorrow afternoon at 5:15, yours is at 2 o'clock. At 5:15, Rich Leonori, another AIA architect and good friend of mine, will conduct a tour on Lackawanna Avenue. And then there'll be a book signing at the Albright's.
At the Library Express.
Yeah, Library Express afterwards. And then Saturday, Glenna and I will conduct a tour in Dunmore, starting from Jane's childhood home, 1712 Monroe Avenue, and we'll walk a few blocks around that area, the neighborhood that she experienced as a child. You have a question?
Yeah. Hi, my question is about what you see as making the difference in cities that want to preserve their historical structures and those that don't. Scranton has not been good about doing that. I see, like now, they're kind of converting structures, which is a good sign, but there's a big difference. Some cities that really focus on doing that. My brother, for instance, lives in Saratoga Springs, New York, and there it's like, really important to preserve the historical structures downtown and make that as part of their tourism for people to want to go there. There's a lot of restaurants downtown, a lot of festivals that bring people in from out of the city, and I was just wondering, like, what do you see as the difference in cities that embrace that and those that don't, that just, throw away that possibility?
Oh, gosh. I mean, to me, tearing down buildings that are beautiful and valuable kind of represents a lack of pride in what you have and a lack of connection to the past. And, that was something that Jane initially was really concerned about, stopping urban renewal and stopping the destruction of whole neighborhoods, not just individual buildings. And in fact, she came back and tried to stop the demolition of a big chunk of Lackawanna Avenue here. I think it's a good thing to work towards, and it's part of helping cities to value our old buildings. But there are other components as well, and I couldn't help pointing out in my talk that a lot of the beautiful buildings that Scranton had, unfortunately, were not preserved, and they weren't torn down for necessarily terrific things such as parking lots or parking garages or so. But I think there's been a change in the mentality in a lot of places. I hope. So thank you for bringing that up and for your question. All righty. Well, I want to thank everybody again for coming and for coming out when we're still social distancing, and it's wonderful to see you in person, and wonderful to hear your questions and your interest. So thank you, and thank you to Mayor Cognetti and Maria McDonald and John Cowder and all the wonderful organizations here.